Hello there, and welcome along to episode 7 of the Gardener Ben podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking to Michael Randall, who owns and operates Misfits plants based out of southern Dorset. You can find Michael operating on the Instagram using the tag Misfits plants, so do head over to Instagram and show his account some love. I had the pleasure of meeting Michael this June when he came to our open garden event, complete with a stand of plants. Michael is an incredibly interesting young man with a huge passion for plants of all things unusual, and it's really lovely to see someone else's passion and pure obsession for plants shining through what they do. Before we talk to Michael and ask him a few basic questions, we're going to be talking everything sweet peas today. So whether you like to do an autumn sowing and get yourself ahead of the growing season for next year, or whether you like to sow your sweet pea seeds in February and March and leave your greenhouse and growing spaces dormant during the winter months, there are two real ways of looking at this. As a general rule, traditionally I always sow my sweet peas in late January or the beginning of February, ensuring myself around a 6-week break from my greenhouse, meaning I can relax over the Christmas period and not worry about the temperatures or the things I might have to look after and water. However, over the recent years the weather has changed substantially and there is a huge culture moving towards the autumn sowing. Plants sown in October and November will get themselves established and are growing away quite nicely in the cooler temperatures, meaning they can be bedded out much earlier and hopefully be in flower by the end of May or the very beginning of June. Now obviously gardening is not a rush, and I would never suggest you do anything that you feel uncomfortable doing. In fact, always choose the method that's correct for yourself. But this year I'm going to go ahead and do a part sowing in the autumn and double it up with a sowing in February and March as normal, ensuring I should have a nice spacing between the plants and of course their flowering season. I'm renowned across my Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and TikTok channels for my sweet peas. I grow exhibit quality sweet peas with stems in excess of 15 to 20 inches in length. Now I know sweet peas will always be beautiful no matter how long their stems, but there is something absolutely magical about a sweet pea with a stem of around 12 to 20 inches long. Picking huge bunches of these to give to family members, friends, neighbours and even work colleagues is something that I really enjoy doing during the high summer months. And nothing apart from roses gives me more pleasure than picking sweet peas at 5 o'clock in the morning. So here's my guide to everything that you need to know about successfully growing sweet peas in your garden. First of all, we need to touch base with the way that these things are grown. Sweet peas are incredibly hungry. They're hungry for food and they're hungry for water. Growing them in large pots or grow bags really isn't a particularly good idea, and much as it can be tweaked to make it more successful, wherever possible sweet peas should be grown in very well mulched and fertile open ground. I start my mulching regime for my sweet pea patch in October and November, heaping large amounts of soil conditioner onto the soil surface just before the weather really turns and things start to get cold. Piling up at least 6 inches deep, I leave it there on the soil surface to rot and be incorporated into the soil structure during the winter months. Obviously this process is aided by the cold and frost and of course the rain that we get over the winter months. I don't do any digging whatsoever to the sweet pea patch and make sure that I move the location that I'm growing in every 2 to 3 years, as of course peas are a member of the legume and pea family and can get club rot and club root. If you don't have access to open growing soil conditions and you want to give these wonderful scented plants a go, growing them either in a grow bag or in a large container, I would suggest several little pointers to help you along with this. Choose a plastic tub, something around 50 to 70 centimetres in diameter and at least 50 to 70 centimetres deep. Make sure that you have a water retaining saucer that can go underneath the pot. This will aid you in your watering. Before you plant your sweet peas into the bucket when it comes to bedding out, also line it with about 5 or 6 layers of newspaper. We do this to not only slow down the leaching of the water through the pot itself, but also to help catch any nutrient value, because you're going to be piling on feed to the sweet peas very, very regularly indeed. If you can follow these basic steps, you can grow on a wigwam in a large pot very successfully. but unfortunately they won't last for very long. And if you see any signs that they're starting to yellow or go powdery from the base, unfortunately you need to really up your watering and the intensity and regularly feed them as well. Always start wherever possible with good quality sweet pea seeds. Now I confess I'm a little bit of a snob with these and only ever really buy my sweet peas from one source, which is Somerset Sweet Peas. It's a small, independent and family-run business, growing exhibit quality sweet peas and providing seeds to the trade. You can find them exhibiting at small local shows across Hampshire, Dorset and Wiltshire during the summer months, often found at the New Forest Show, exhibiting their beautiful bunches of sweet peas and often selling small quantities of seed at the same time. I always make sure that I get my order in early and know exactly what I'm sowing by the end of the season. So by the time I'm stripping out the sweet peas, normally in late July and early August, my order is already placed. As soon as it's arrived, place your seeds into an airtight container and either place them in the back of a fridge or, if you can, into the freezer. Seeds stored like this can store for up to 15 to 20 years in really good condition, and it also starts conditioning them for the process I'm going to talk you through next. When you're ready to sow your sweet peas, whether that's now in October and November, or whether you're going to be waiting until the end of January and into the beginning of February, the process is exactly the same. You want to start them off slow and steady, but don't skip the chitting process. There's always a lot of noise about this particular process with different people, and it can be done in several different ways. You need to first appreciate that the pea is part of the legume family and therefore has a really, really tough outer coating of the seed itself, allowing it to store for decades on end without being spoiled. You really need to break through this hard outer coating to ensure the seed germinates and grows before it rots, especially at low temperatures. And we do this through the process of chitting. This can be done in several ways. You can either take the seeds and place them on a small piece of emery board and rub them with a piece of emery paper or very, very fine sandpaper, just to lightly scratch the outer surface. You can also take the very, very outer edges off of the seed using a pair of nail clippers. I find this particular method a little dangerous and a little bit unpredictable. Having huge hands, it's very difficult to hold the seeds still. So I prefer the lazy option, which simply involves opening the seeds around 12 to 36 hours before you actually want to go ahead and sow. Label your seeds and make sure that you have everything organised, and place the contents of each individual packet, variety by variety, into a small glass jar. Fill that jar with a small amount of tepid water and keep them in the house for around 12 to 36 hours. This process just softens the outer coating of the seed, and after a day or so you'll see the outer coating has actually split open and the seed is then ready to sow. I find it best at this stage to keep yourself super organised and sow everything in small labelled batches, so you know exactly where everything is, because the time that it's between now and, of course, when you come to bed them out, normally in late April and early May, there's an awful lot of water that passes under the bridge in those moments, so you need to keep you organised and make sure your labels are in place. When you're ready to sow, I prefer to put mine into toilet roll tubes, and I do this for a reason. Not only are they incredibly easy, they're obviously free, and it means the entire lot can be planted out into the garden in one go, with no disturbance to the root systems whatsoever. Sowing in small batches of between 10 and 20 seeds at a time means I can place the toilet roll tubes into a large 3 or 4 litre pot to keep them upright. And all I do here is throw a couple of handfuls of compost, peat-free of course, into the very bottom of the pot to give the toilet roll tubes something to stand on. Pack the pot full of toilet roll tubes until it can take no more, and fill these 3/4 of the way up with good quality, fully organic garden compost. Preferably something that has a small amount of loam or John Innings No. 3 blended through it. This gives it a little bit of weight and holds the moisture much better through the months ahead. Once you've filled your toilet roll tubes up by around 3/4, give them a thoroughly good firm down with your fingers, and you may want to go back over them and just top them off so they're around 75 to 80% full. I then go ahead and sow 1 sweet pea seed per toilet roll tube. popping it straight into the middle of the tube and then covering it lightly in around 1/4 to 1/2 inch of compost. I then give them a thoroughly good water, make sure they're labelled, and they all go into the unheated greenhouse on a heat mat. This is the really important part. You need to get the seeds moving and germinate as quickly as possible. Otherwise, at low temperatures, your very precious and often expensive seeds can rot before they actually get moving. So place them on a heat mat with a cloche over the top just to get them moving. And as soon as you see any signs of germination and green tips appearing from the compost, switch off the heat mat but leave the cloche in place. Once you have full germination, this normally takes around 14 to 20 days, you can actually remove the cloche and start hardening them off. Your sweet peas will grow away very, very slow and steadily all the way through the winter, and should be kept in an unheated greenhouse or unheated cold frame throughout the winter months. As soon as your young plants have produced between 3 and 4 sets of true leaves, it's then time to pinch them out. We do this to encourage the production of side and lateral growth, producing strong, stocky and healthy plants. It's at this point I will start my feeding regime. If at any time during the growing process all the way through to flowering, your plants start to go yellow or go powdery at the base, unfortunately you have already lost the battle, and it is best to overfeed a sweet pea than it is to actually underfeed it. So as soon as I've pinched them out, I start giving them a liquid feed of Envy Sea Feed Extra at least once every 2 weeks during this period. I apply this at half the normal dose rate and water it on all over the leaves. Sweet peas are notoriously hungry for iron in very specific quantities, and you need to make sure that you drench the leaves thoroughly with a fine watering can rose as you water, as most of the iron is actually absorbed through the stems and the leaves themselves. I'll continue feeding until I bed them out, and as soon as I've bedded them out in late April to early May, as soon as we're through the worst parts of the weather, I will then start feeding once a week. Once my sweet peas have started actually producing blooms, I will actually feed them at full strength every time I pick. So whether that's 3 times a week or whether it's just once a week, my sweet peas will get at least 3 or 4 gallons of Sea Feed Extra from Envy at least once or 2 or maybe 3 times a week, depending on how often I'm picking. It's at this point that you really want to keep piling on the feed if you want your flowers to keep coming, and make sure that you always pick every single bloom that they produce. At the end of the day, I'm growing these as a picking crop. They are not for decorative use in the garden, and as soon as they set any seeds whatsoever, the plant generally starts to go into decline and you've lost the battle. So the more flowers that you pick, the more flowers that they will produce. They should always be planted wherever possible in full sun, on a south or west facing aspect. Remember, sweet peas will want to climb to at least 8 to 10 feet in height, so a 3 or 4 foot wigwam is simply not going to be enough, and they will very quickly outgrow the structure or support that you've given them. I always make my wigwams out of hazel canes and pea sticks, and if I'm lucky, these structures last for around 1 or 2 years, and need a little bit of bolstering in the 2nd or 3rd year before I actually move the sweet pea growing bay to somewhere else in the garden. Following these basic tips and making sure that you're giving them a large amount of water and large amounts of feed and mulch will make sure that you have very, very long and beautiful stems. Many growers will go to the painstaking effort of removing the tendrils to make sure they don't get caught up. But realistically, if you produce your wigwams at the right sort of angles, these have never really caused me a huge amount of problems. If you want to follow my sweet pea growing guides, please do head over to Instagram, YouTube or TikTok, where you can find them posted over the next few weeks. If you have any questions or comments regarding the process of sowing sweet peas, either in October or November, or whether you plan to make a spring sowing later on and early in the new year, don't hesitate to leave me a comment on one of the videos or below this particular podcast. Right, if you think that I'm obsessed with plants, you need to have a little bit of a think again. I have the pleasure in introducing to you Michael Randall from Misfits Plants, who owns and operates his small independent houseplant business from his family farm in South Dorset. As I mentioned earlier, Michael came to our open garden event back in June, bringing with him his plant stand and some of his favourite plants to sell. It was very apparent from the conversations we had over that weekend that Michael was absolutely obsessed and hugely passionate about plants. So I'll let Michael introduce himself now.
Hello, my name is Michael. I have my own nursery called Misfit Plants, and the plants I grow are weird and wonderful. I live in southwest Dorset. I live and work on the family farm, as well as care for my parents, and when I'm not doing that, I'm generally looking after and growing various weird and wonderful plants. I got into horticulture, essentially, not through accident, but just sort of through not sidestepping farming, but just something adjacent, really, because growing up, I would go to the agricultural shows with my parents, exhibiting livestock, be it sheep, poultry, and the like. And after judging, I would go AWOL. Even from a very young age, I would wander off and end up in the horticultural marquee or the flower exhibit, basically annoying the other exhibitors there and asking them questions and essentially just buying plants from them. And that was from all the age of 4, 5, if not older, really. I wouldn't quite wander off at that age. But yes, I've been into horticulture for a lot of my life at the moment. I'm only the age of 34. But yes, I spend most mornings working on the farm, sorting out the livestock, doing what chores need doing. Then in the afternoons, I'm in my polytunnel greenhouses, sorting out my orchids, predominantly miniatures, hardy aerums, antropicals, tillandsias, the air plants, and lots of carnivorous and all creeds and colours, and sometimes in the conservatory with all the succulents and some of the cacti I've got. And I grow a lot more weird and wonderful things other than those that I mentioned.
Now, it's quite evident from having met Michael myself and seeing the huge and vast variations and types of plants that he grows, that his setup that he has at home to produce his nursery stock is a little more complicated than he at first lets on. So I wanted to hear from Michael himself what his setup looks like and how many greenhouses it was taking to really scratch all of his plant itches.
My setups consist of several glass houses and a polytunnel and a conservatory. So in the conservatory, I have got all my succulents, predominantly small growing or miniatures, because for me, anywhere in my setup, space is always an issue. So it's a south-facing conservatory that's attached to the house. It gets no direct heating, but as much sun as I can give it. And drops to about, at the lowest, 5 Celsius in there. And that's, I've got all my Haworthias, aloes, syringias, calencos, all sorts really. And up in my largest glass house, which is 12 by 40 foot, it's a Dutch light. And that's got all my hardy carnivorous in essentially, so all the Sarracenias, the Venus flytraps, hardy Drosseras, a few Pinguiculas and Utriculas, and that I let freeze in the winter and keep everything damp to wet all the time, as you would with nearly all carnivorous plants that are hardy. And rainwater, good sunlight, and the only reason why they're really in a glass house is to give them that bit of edge in the spring, bring them on a bit more, and also just to protect them from the wind. Sarracenias are very tall and just catch the wind very easily and can just distort and bend and break. Then in my polytunnel, that's sort of divided into half. One half is the working section, which means I've got all the pots or my compost where I do all my potting up, dividing and the like. And that's, as I said, full of pots, compost, where I keep all my crates for travelling plants in when I'm doing events. Then in the other half, I have some of my more tender stuff that goes out in the summer but comes in the winter. Things that can go down to 0 but won't appreciate going lower, such things like some of my hardy arums, which are, yes, they're hardy, but they won't appreciate being frosted quite heavily. Ferns of all creeds and varieties, then like canna species, tropiolums, the tuberous varieties, and all sorts of hardy orchids that will take being frozen but won't appreciate it too much. Then in my heated glass house, I have all sorts. So I've got tropical carnivorous miniature orchids, hoyas, various shade-loving plants like calatheas, marantas, and lots of air plants. I think I've got over 70 or 80 species or cultivars, and they all like very good sunlight, good humidity, and the lowest I let it go down to is about 12 in the winter. So I mainly grow Highland Nepenthes, which are one of the carnivorous, and I essentially cater for them, and everything else must follow suit. So I grow plants at like the same conditions, and yeah, I then have all sorts of things scattered all over the place, be it seedlings of very hardy stuff which can stay outside. Then I germinate seedlings in my living room in a propagator I've got. So I've literally got plants all over everywhere, and joys of having a farm, really.
Well, goodness me. By the sounds of things, Michael, you're living the horticultural dream. I would absolutely love to have the space for a greenhouse of that size. I think you mentioned there you've got one that's 12 foot by 40 foot, which I just couldn't imagine having access to and being able to grow. I'm sure, like every other gardener, that it is really easy for you to fill these spaces very quickly and soon outgrow your growing spaces. So it must be quite helpful having shows where you can actually sell plants from and then be able to grow more plants to fill the space again. And I understand it's a really difficult question for any real passionate gardener to answer, but what are your favourite plants to grow?
Oh, that's a hard one for favourite plants. I have so many different varieties, species, growth habits, and just requirements, and it seems to depend on the time of the year, really. But I think at the moment, and things that do catch my eye throughout the year are the tillandsias, the bromeliads, or air plants. All of them, far as I'm aware, come from everywhere from the southern states of North America right down to the bottom of South America. And they grow in a vast array of environments, and they're just so diverse for one particular family, essentially. You can get miniatures that get no bigger than a £2 coin, to species, again, of the same family that can be 6, almost 8 foot across. And they're just the diversity in the family is just so interesting for me. It's one of the things I love about plants is you can have one family, but they come from all over the world. And so you get different varieties or growth habits or just ways they've evolved in the environment they are in. But with the air plants, general care is quite easy, essentially. Good humidity or regular watering. Rainwater is a must because in quite a lot of the areas, and especially my area in southwest Dorset, the water is very hard. And so the calcium molecules in your tap water will actually block the pores they absorb the water through. So it's a bit like us trying to have a drink with a golf ball in our mouth. We get a bit, but not enough. And over time, they just end up dehydrating. And people say, oh, I just keep them in the bathroom and they'll live off the humidity. It's like, yeah, they will, but you're not having a bath or a shower for 18 hours plus a day, creating 85 to almost 100% humidity. So giving them a dunk or a mist of rainwater is ideally the best thing for them. And good sunny position, but like ourselves, the more heat and sun they get, the more water they need. And some species can adapt or have adapted for that sort of environment, whilst others, like more height, come from more of a high rainfall area. But yeah, the tillandsias are very, very diverse. Some are very good for paludariums or terrariums because they're a bit more terrestrial in the habit, but then you get some which live literally on the tips of branches and get direct rainfall, and so they can grow more for like a tree frog enclosure or dart frog enclosure, add a bit more interest to the enclosures, or just something to have it nice in the house because you can mount them onto whatever you want really, because they just use their roots for hanging on. They don't absorb anything through them. So you can use a hot glue gun on a cool setting or a wire frame to hang them on, and they just do their own thing. They're very amenable as long as you get the basics. In other words, rainwater, good humidity, and temperatures, I would say, no lower than 5. So they can go outside during the summer months. And mine do. I try to get everything out of my heated greenhouse Tillandsia-wise. Gives me able to go through plants and work out what I've got, and also just gives the plants a change and the like.
Goodness me, I wish I had known this earlier. Like Michael, I'm always drawn to the weird, the rare and unusual plants. And about a year ago visited a local garden centre that had just had a huge delivery of air plants. And I thought, what better way of packing some weird and unusual plants into the houseplant collection where plants wouldn't normally be able to grow. So I treated myself to several and believed I was making the right decisions when I was actually dunking them in bowls of water from our dehumidifier. I thought this was the correct way of doing it, and I thought it was much better than using tap water, which I knew to be really hard and obviously packed full of chlorine. Obviously, rainwater is not always available, but I had absolutely no idea that the water would probably still be too harsh for them and mean they were not able to drink. So I was completely dumbfounded after several months when they slowly dried up, withered up, and eventually died, when I thought I'd been watering them more than enough. So maybe I'll need to give them another go. I want to thank Michael for actually joining me on today's podcast and sharing his huge passion for plants. Many of the items he was talking about, I wouldn't actually know what they actually look like if he hadn't come to our open garden event back in June, and I'd seen the huge array and vast quantities of plants that he grows with my own eyes. So thank you to Michael for that. Head across to his Instagram channel and I'll make sure that I tag him in the bio for this particular upload and show him and his account some love. Thank you for joining me on episode 7 of the Gardener Ben podcast. I'll talk to you again next week. And until then, happy gardening.